Hi everyone, this is a set of videos or lectures on Chapter 6.1, which is about histograms. Before we talk about histograms themselves, we have to talk about a little bit of terminology. If I take a data set and ask what's the frequency of something happening, like how many households had 0 children in a city, the frequency is how many of those households did, which is something like maybe 50,000 of them. The relative frequency is what percent of the time a household had zero children. And then a histogram is a bar graph either of the frequencies or relative frequencies. It tells how often things happened. Not just any bar graph. Some bar graphs don't tell how often each thing happened. So let's say a city is looking at how many kids are in the city by households because they want to be planning for their schools, number of teachers, number of classrooms, and so forth. So they might end up with a data table like this where they're asking how many households have 0 kids in the household, and maybe 50,000 of the households in the city have that. How many households have 1 kid? Maybe 14,000, etc. So these would be the frequencies, and then if I take that 50,000 and divide by 84,000, that would give me this. You can see I'm doing the division there. I've got dollar signs in the denominator because I want to fill this down and keep referring to that 84,000. So these are the frequencies, these are the relative frequencies, and I can make a bar graph of these frequencies, not including the total. Go to Insert, and then this little icon is bar graphs. And so a histogram is a bar graph that tells how often things happened. Does this tell us how often things happened? Can I tell here how many households had 0 kids? Well, actually these numbers are a little bit off, right? This is a 1, but it should be a 0. So I can click Select Data, and then under Horizontal Axis Labels, say Edit, and choose these numbers here, and then it knows what the proper label should be. So this tells me how many times a 0 happened, how many times a 1 happened, how many times a 2 happened, how many times a 3 or more happened. One thing some stats professors insist on is that all the bars should touch each other because there's really no possibility of being between 0 and 1 children, at least in some ways of thinking. Excel doesn't do that automatically. I'm never going to penalize you for it, but here's how to do it in case you're curious. If you click on the bar, Format Data Series, and reduce that gap width to, you could use 0%, or if you want to be able to see the distinctions between bars, you can set it to something like 3%, so you get just a little hint of a gap there. Alright, so that's our histogram based on frequencies. We can do the same thing for relative frequencies by just changing the selection there, and now it's showing us what percent of the time each thing happened. Usually all the bars have the same width. That's happening here. They have the same width on the screen, although this 3 or more in some sense should go kind of farther to the right because it includes 4 and 5 and 6 kids. So you kind of have to be careful with categories like 3 or more. One quick thing to think about here, this 84,000, is that the total? It says total. Is it the total number of children in the city, or is the total number of households in the city? Maybe pause the video, think about that, and when you've come up with an answer, unpause the video. That's the total number of households in the city. Let's take a look at another data set. I've been asking students in one of my classes that I teach a lot, how many credit hours are you taking this semester? So here's a bunch of their answers. It's pretty much the real data, but not exactly. And instead of putting people's names or their actual EID numbers, I just made up a bunch of random ones here. So if I make an initial bar graph, something like just highlight these and go Insert, Columns, like that, is this a histogram? Does it show how often each number of credit hours got taken, or how many students took 12 credit hours, how many students took 9 credit hours? No, it's showing me that person 1 took 12 credit hours, but it's not showing me how many other people took 12 credit hours. I can see there's a few others here, but this is not a histogram, so we'll say that here. It is a bar chart, but it's not showing me how often people took 12 credit hours. Let me show another version of that. So we'll do a bar chart on the whole data set. Does that show me how often things happened? Not really. I'd have to spend a lot of time eyeballing to figure out how many of these bars were 12 credits high, and I don't really want to go counting them. It does show me some things though, like an outlier here and an outlier in there, but it's still not a histogram. To make it, let's move that up to the top. To make a histogram, we can select all the data, and newer versions of Excel have a histogram graph type. So I can, once I've got it selected, I can come up to Insert, and instead of this bar chart, I choose this bar chart and do this one. And is that telling me how often each thing happened? This bar is how many people were taking between 3 and 5.5 credits. That's a little weird. To change the width of the bars, I can double click on the axis, come over here to Format Axis, Axis Options, Bin Width. Let's just use 1 credit hour as the bin width. So this is telling me how many people were taking between 4 and 5, and there's an open parenthesis on the 4, which means it's not included. So this is basically just 5. How many people were taking between 5 and 6, not including 5, so that's 6 credit hours, and we can see that 9 people over here were taking basically 6 credit hours. So this is a histogram. One thing this doesn't give us is a table we can use, kind of like we could use this table. It kind of makes the table behind the scenes. And I'll record a separate video about how you can make a table like that yourself. That's a really useful skill with a tool called pivot tables. Just to clarify what's going on here, let's do the right thing and add some axis titles. So the primary horizontal axis here is credit hours this semester, and the y-axis title should be this is how many times it happened, so that would be the frequency. Compare that to this graph, which is not a histogram. It has an x-axis of person number in the data set, and its y-axis is the number of credit hours that that person took. So the credit hours this semester is on a different axis between these two graphs here. Here's another quick data set. One year I asked my Math110 students to walk from the middle of the green lot on the north end of campus to Pray Herald and time themselves, and then they reported their times. So here's a histogram of their times. So you can see the most common time bucket was between 7.7 minutes and 8.7 minutes. But some people were down in even 3 and 4 minutes. I'm not sure about the person who clocked this time. There was no one who would have obviously taken a much longer time to walk than anyone else, so that's an outlier that we could go investigate.